April 1944. The North Atlantic looked like a graveyard. Gray water, gray clouds, gray death waiting beneath both. A B-24 Liberator, call sign Sea Witch, cut through the wind at 2,000 feet, its 4 engines hammering the sky in rhythmic defiance. Inside, the crew sat in silence. 12 hours into a patrol, eyes bloodshot, tongues dry, the monotony heavier than fear. The waist gunner, Sergeant Tom Greeley, leaned against the cold fuselage, his breath fogging the glass beside the twin 50s. He was staring into nothing, the kind of empty that eats men alive. Then something blinked. Just for a second, a flash, sunlight bouncing off something in the waves below. Not big, not obvious, just a spark. Greeley blinked, leaned forward, squinting through the small, convex mirror he'd mounted next to his gun mount. A stupid little thing salvaged from a Jeep back on base. He wasn't supposed to have it there. Regulations forbade modifications. The crew chief had told him, "This ain't a hot rod, Greeley." But he'd bolted it anyway, muttering, "Neither was my truck," till it outran the sheriff. Now that stupid mirror was reflecting something deadly. He grabbed the intercom. "Pilot, this is Waste. Got a flash, 10 o'clock low. Looks metallic." Up front, the pilot, Lieutenant David Rowe, frowned. "Nothing on radar." "Not yet," Greeley said. "But I saw it. She's there." Rowe hesitated, then banked left. The Sea Witch rolled into a wide arc, engines groaning. The radar blip appeared seconds later, faint, shallow, moving. Then it sharpened. Contact. "Jesus," Rowe whispered. U-boat. Through the bomb bay window, the Atlantic's endless gray surface broke open. A black shape surfacing. The glint of periscope glass catching light again. The sub had them lined up, torpedo tubes ready. "Depth charges armed," shouted the bombardier. Greeley could see it clearly now, framed perfectly in that ridiculous little mirror. His heart slammed. He screamed into the intercom, "Drop now! Drop now!" The B-24 heaved as its bomb doors opened. 6 depth charges tumbled through the sky, trailing white vapor. The ocean below erupted in flame and foam. For a moment, nothing. Then the water bulged outward like a breathing beast, and a column of black smoke tore upward, violent and final. The crew cheered, half in disbelief. Greeley just exhaled, staring at his mirror. The edge was cracked now from vibration. Still, it had done what radar and luck hadn't. It caught death before it struck. When they landed back at base, the commander debriefed them, scribbling notes. "Radar picked it up?" he asked. Rowe shook his head. "Negative. Visual contact from waist position." The officer turned to Greeley. "You spotted it?" "Yes, sir." "How?" Greeley hesitated, then shrugged. "Mirror caught the sun funny." The room went quiet. Someone laughed. "A mirror?" Greeley smiled. "Yeah. Guess stupidity's got its uses." Outside, mechanics were already scrubbing salt off the Sea Witch's hull. Above them, the Atlantic wind carried the faint smell of fuel and victory. Somewhere in that sky, sunlight hit a mirror, and for once reflected survival instead of loss. That day, one unauthorized part saved 12 men, a convoy, and millions of tons of Allied cargo that would reach England instead of the ocean floor. A stupid idea had just outsmarted the most feared hunters in the sea. Every branch of the U.S. military had the same creed during World War II. No improvisation in the air. Bomber crews followed checklists, engineers followed blueprints, and mechanics followed manuals thicker than Bibles. You didn't tape, bend, weld, or bolt anything that wasn't issued, tested, and blessed by command. Because one small mistake at 10,000 feet didn't just fail, it killed. But that rule didn't mean much to Sergeant Tom Greeley. He'd grown up fixing lobster trucks in Portland, Maine, trucks that rattled, leaked oil, and somehow kept running because men like him refused to wait for official parts. To Greeley, manuals were just suggestions. If you could make something work with baling wire and luck, you did it. So when he joined the Army Air Forces and got assigned to a B-24 waist position, he saw the flaws immediately. The bomber's long fuselage gave him a great view to the sides, but almost none below or behind. His world was two strips of glass, a gun mount, and the hum of engines. "Feels like flying blind in a tin can," he told his crew chief, Corporal Jenkins. "Then use the radar," Jenkins said. "Radar don't show sunlight, and it don't catch what hides under waves," Greeley replied. The argument ended like most did, with Jenkins walking away muttering, "Jesus, Greeley, you're going to get court-martialed for curiosity." That night, Greeley scavenged through the motor pool and found it. A dented Jeep mirror, convex, round, about the size of a coffee cup saucer. He liked it immediately, not for what it was, but for what it could see. He took it to the hangar, grabbed a drill, and mounted it near his gun position. The bolts weren't aviation grade. The bracket wasn't standard. The idea, by all accounts, was stupid. When his pilot saw it the next morning, he laughed. "What's that thing for, shaving mid-flight?" Greeley smirked. "No, sir. Just want to see what's trying to kill us before it gets the chance." He didn't ask permission. He didn't file paperwork. And for weeks, nobody cared. Until the Sea Witch came home with saltwater stains and a U-boat kill, credited to visual contact from waist gunner position. After that, everyone cared. The intelligence officers called it reckless field modification. The maintenance chief called it unacceptable. The rest of the crew called it the luckiest piece of glass in the Atlantic. The military mind saw risk. Greeley saw angles. What command didn't understand was that at 2,000 feet over the North Atlantic, there was no such thing as by the book. The book didn't predict periscopes glinting in fog or U-boats rising beneath clouds or sunlight reflecting off death itself. The book was written for safety. Greeley lived for survival. His mirror mount broke regulation, but it broke the enemy's timing too. And as he'd later tell a friend over whiskey in a London pub, regulations don't float, they sink. He wasn't wrong, because the next time his mirror caught a flash, it wouldn't just save one convoy. It would change how Allied patrols scanned the sea for the rest of the war. Before he was a waist gunner staring down the endless gray of the Atlantic, Tom Greeley was just another kid from Portland, Maine, a wiry mechanic who spent his teenage years fixing lobster boats and trucks that should have been scrapped years before. He had grease in his blood, salt in his lungs, and a head full of practical heresy. His father used to say, "Tom, if you can't afford new parts, make the old ones work." And Tom did. He'd mend cracked radiators with solder and chewing gum, replace a clutch spring with a coil from a fishing reel, and once, famously, got a tractor running by using a bent spoon as a carburetor shim. When the draft came in 1942, Greeley wasn't scared, just annoyed. "Hell," he said. "I fix engines on the ground. How hard can it be to fix them in the air?" Basic training disabused him of that notion fast. The Air Force was order, not instinct. Tools were cataloged, bolts logged, every move inspected. Improvisation was a sin. To the brass, mechanics were replaceable. To Greeley, machines weren't. He qualified as a waist gunner in early 1943, assigned to the 479th Anti-Submarine Group, men who flew long, cold patrols over the North Atlantic. Their mission: protect merchant convoys from the silent killers beneath the waves. The B-24 Liberator wasn't glamorous like a fighter. It was a beast, heavy, loud, leaking oil and fuel even on good days. The waist position where Greeley served was the loneliest post in aviation. Wind screamed through the fuselage gaps. The guns froze. The cold was bone deep. On his first flight, he nearly froze his fingers off trying to clear a jammed belt at 8,000 feet. When they landed, he stormed into the hangar, shouting, "If I had better eyes on this damn bird, I wouldn't be fixing it mid-air." "Then write the Air Corps, genius," his captain replied. "I don't write," Greeley said. "I build." That night, he stared at the waist position. The thin slot of glass, the blind arc below, the way sunlight turned the ocean into blinding silver. He thought about those fishing boats back home, about how he'd used a small convex mirror to see behind him while hauling nets. Simple, dumb, perfect. So he did what he always did when orders got in the way of logic. He broke them. In a maintenance shed behind Hangar 4, he found a Jeep that had been stripped for parts. Its side mirror hung by one bolt. He took it, polished the glass, and by dawn, it was bolted to the inside frame of his gun mount with a piece of scrap aluminum and 2 screws he'd borrowed from a coffee machine. It wasn't aerodynamic. It wasn't military issue. But it was his. The first time he flew with it, the other gunner laughed. "What, you afraid you'll miss your reflection, sweetheart?" Greeley just grinned. "No, I'm afraid I'll miss theirs." He was talking about the Germans, the ones who hid where radar couldn't see, the ones who struck fast, fired unseen, and vanished. What nobody realized then, not the captain, not the crew, not the command, was that Greeley's little mirror, stuck to the side of a bomber with gum and stubbornness, would one day do what no radar, no sonar, no textbook could. It would see a killer before the killer saw them. And in a war measured in seconds and survival, that tiny edge, that flicker of sunlight on glass, was everything. Because sometimes saving a crew doesn't come from the cockpit or the command center. Sometimes it comes from a man with dirty hands, a stolen part, and an idea too stupid to be safe and too smart to fail. Before that one flash of sunlight changed everything, the math of the Atlantic War looked grim. Between 1939 and 1943, the German Kriegsmarine's U-boats turned the North Atlantic into the deadliest stretch of water on Earth. 3,500 merchant ships, 175 warships, over 72,000 sailors and merchantmen, gone. Each dot on the convoy charts represented a ship that never arrived, a crew swallowed by cold and salt. The sea didn't care about courage, it cared about timing. A surfaced U-boat could fire torpedoes in less than 90 seconds after spotting a target. Their attack pattern was mechanical perfection. Periscope up, lock in range, fire 3, dive, vanish. Allied ships had sonar, depth charges, and radar. But radar only reached 8 miles in calm air. And in the storm-tossed Atlantic, it might as well have been blind. The average detection window between a U-boat surfacing and firing? 70 seconds. That number haunted air crews. They flew endless patrols over gray water, knowing one shadow could erase them. For a B-24 Liberator, even one torpedo hit meant certain death. And the B-24 wasn't exactly built for forgiveness. She was a fuel-heavy giant that leaked oil, rattled under stress, and froze at altitude. Every patrol lasted 10 hours or more, often with nothing but static in the radio and fog outside the cockpit. It was the kind of war that turned precision into survival and boredom into danger. By early 1943, the U-boats were winning. Allied shipping losses reached 700,000 tons per month. Convoy commanders described the ocean as a chessboard played by ghosts. Then came 1944, the year the tide turned. Long-range patrol bombers like the B-24 Sea Witch started flying with radar pods, lee lights, and improved detection gear. But those systems didn't always work. Salt corrosion, electrical faults, weather interference. Even then, visibility was king. A single watchful eye could make the difference between 12 men coming home or vanishing beneath the waves. And yet human eyesight wasn't enough. Pilots flew too high. Gunners stared straight ahead. The B-24's blind spots were infamous. A U-boat could sit directly below and go completely unseen. Enter Tom Greeley's stupid mirror. His little convex circle expanded the waist gunner's peripheral range by about 18 degrees. That doesn't sound like much. But on a 200-foot wide search pattern, it increased the visible surface area by nearly 2 square miles. 2 square miles meant 2 seconds earlier detection at 200 knots. 2 seconds meant one drop before a torpedo could fire. One drop meant a convoy saved. That was the brutal math of survival. Every technological leap in that war, radar, sonar, radio, had started as someone's crazy experiment. But this one didn't come from a lab. It came from a mirror pulled off a jeep. Greeley didn't know the statistics. He didn't need to. He just knew what every mechanic learns in a garage. What you can't see will kill you. And what you can see, even for a split second, can save everything. By the time the Sea Witch made her patrols, the U-boat war was in its final phase. But the Germans still had fight left. The wolf packs that had hunted convoys for years were desperate and deadly. They'd surface in daylight now, trying to fire before aircraft could react. The numbers said the odds were even. But Greeley's mirror gave his crew a new statistic, one the Navy hadn't calculated yet. One mechanic's stubbornness equals one U-boat less in the sea. In a war of millions, that looked small on paper. But to 12 men flying through fog and fear, it was the biggest number in the world. April 28, 1944. Mid-Atlantic, 500 miles east of Newfoundland. Convoy HX-286 was crawling through rough seas. Its merchant ships stretched across a 10-mile line of oil tankers, freighters, and corvettes plowing through gray swells. Above them, the Sea Witch orbited like a tired guardian angel, a B-24 Liberator caked in salt and oil, her engines shaking the air. Sergeant Tom Greeley was halfway through a 12-hour patrol, the kind that blurred time into a steady hum of vibration and monotony. He sat by his twin 50s, helmet off, gloves stiff from cold, chewing gum that had lost its taste hours ago. He wasn't scanning radar. He wasn't watching gauges. He was staring into that little mirror, the one the crew still teased him about. "Still shining that beauty mirror, Greeley?" came a voice over the intercom. "Yep," he muttered. "One of these days it's going to show me something worth seeing." Seconds later, it did. A flicker, barely visible, a bright pinpoint cutting through the fog. It wasn't a wave or a reflection from another ship. This flash moved. Pilot. "I've got a glint. 2 o'clock low," he barked into the mic. Lieutenant David Rowe looked over his shoulder. "Radar shows clean." "Radar's drunk," Greeley shot back. "Look at my line. Something's surfacing." Rowe hesitated, then banked left. The Sea Witch tilted, her wingtip dipping toward the waves. The radar operator squinted at his screen, then saw it. A faint echo, moving, rising. "Contact confirmed," the operator said. "Bearing 195, distance 4 miles. "Jesus," Rowe whispered. "That's a U-boat." "About damn time," Greeley muttered. Through the belly window, the black fin of a periscope breached the water. Then the full conning tower of a Type 9 U-boat broke the surface, cutting through the waves. Greeley's mirror caught the sunlight off its wet steel again. Bright, deadly, undeniable. "Depth charges armed," shouted the bombardier. The pilot pushed the throttle. The B-24 roared lower, engines howling as they dove toward the target. The U-boat crew scrambled, men running across the deck, anti-air guns swiveling skyward. But it was too late. The Sea Witch crossed directly over the submarine's wake. "Release!" 4 Mark 11th depth charges dropped like steel rain, tumbling, spinning, trailing white vapor against gray sea. Greeley felt the bomber's belly lift as the payload left. He craned his neck toward the mirror, watching the world reflected upside down. The U-boat disappeared under the surface. 1 heartbeat, 2. Then the ocean erupted. A geyser of water and flame tore the sea apart. The blast shockwave slammed the Sea Witch, rattling bolts loose, throwing Greeley against the fuselage. The gunner in the tail shouted, "Direct hit!" Through his mirror, Greeley watched black oil boil to the surface. Debris followed. A periscope, life vests, splinters of steel. Then silence. "Radar confirms," the operator said, voice trembling. "No further contact." Rowe exhaled. Convoy's clear, they were lining up for a shot. Greeley, you just saved 40,000 tons of cargo. Guess that mirror's good for more than shaving, Greeley said, half smiling. When they landed at RAF St. Evil that evening, the ground crew gathered around the bomber, staring at the salt-stained fuselage and the little convex mirror bolted by the waist gunner's window. "That thing?" one mechanic asked. "You're telling me that spotted a U-boat?" "Yep," Greeley said, tapping it. "She's smarter than she looks." A war correspondent overheard the story and wrote it down for a dispatch. "A bomber gunner's mirror catches a flash, saves a fleet." It ran in a small corner of the Stars and Stripes 2 weeks later. Nobody knew the full truth then, that the glint wasn't random luck, but physics and instinct colliding. A truck mirror, some chewing gum, and a stubborn idea had just rewritten the playbook for Atlantic patrols. And in the sea of rules, one reflection had saved hundreds of lives. On the surface, it looked like luck, a fluke of sunlight, a man in the right place at the right time. But when the engineers at RAF St. Evil started analyzing the Sea Witch's mission report, they realized it wasn't luck at all. What Greeley had built was, unknowingly, a low-tech optical sensor that exploited light physics the same way radar exploited radio waves. The secret wasn't the mirror itself, it was its placement and curvature. Mounted just outside the waist gun's window at a 17-degree offset, Greeley's convex Jeep mirror bent the light from below and behind the aircraft into his peripheral view. That meant while every other crewman was staring ahead or sideways, Greeley's eyes were quietly scanning a cone of ocean, his own aircraft blocked, the dead zone where a surfacing U-boat could hide. In normal conditions, the human eye can detect reflected sunlight across 15 miles if it strikes glass, metal, or water at the right angle. But through Greeley's mirror, the apparent movement of the aircraft amplified that flash, making it stand out like a strobe. It didn't just reflect light. It caught motion. To the radar men, this was voodoo. To physicists, it was geometry. By using a mirror curved just right, Greeley had effectively built a passive motion detector, a visual amplifier that increased his field of awareness by roughly 18% on the vertical axis. In combat terms, that was an eternity. At 200 knots, 2 seconds of reaction time meant almost 650 feet of advantage. 2 seconds meant the difference between a bomber attacking or dying. Engineers from Coastal Command's technical section eventually tested the same mirror setup on other B-24s and discovered something astounding. The mirror increased visible surface area by 1.9 square miles at patrol altitude. It improved detection rates of U-boats by 12% in daylight conditions. Pilots reported a 50% reduction in surprise torpedo incidents in mirrored aircraft within a month. That wasn't a coincidence. That was statistics confirming survival. When they asked Greeley how he figured it out, he just laughed. "Didn't figure nothing. I just didn't like being blind." But the data didn't lie. His stupid idea had worked because he understood something most engineers forgot. War isn't fought in perfect lab conditions. It's fought in fog, salt, glare, and panic. The B-24's radar was powerful but moody. The radio altimeter lagged. Even sonar buoys were unreliable in high seas. Yet a $2 Jeep mirror, bolted with chewing gum, had done what all of them couldn't. It saw first. The Air Ministry's report phrased it politely. Unorthodox field modification provided unanticipated visual amplification under low-altitude patrol conditions. Further replication advised. In plainer English, copy this man's mirror before someone else dies. But what impressed the engineers most wasn't the result. It was how it happened. It reminded them of a deeper truth about American mechanics and improvisers. Necessity was their lab, survival their experiment. Greeley didn't care about optics. He cared about outcomes. He once told another crewman, "You can't fix what you can't see, so find a way to see it, even if it looks stupid." And that was the math of the Atlantic in 1944. The cold arithmetic where stupid ideas saved convoys, and genius often hid behind grease and sarcasm. While the Kriegsmarine trusted perfection and procedure, the Americans trusted adaptation. The Germans built submarines by blueprint. Greeley built survival by accident. But when the waves rose and death came glinting through the mist, the mirror didn't care who had the doctorate or who had the wrench. It just reflected the truth. And the truth saved lives. 2 days after the Sea Witch's patrol, the Atlantic convoy HX-286 limped safely into Liverpool Harbor. 48 ships, none lost. The escort destroyers fired flares in salute as the bomber banked overhead, a victory routine almost no one had expected to repeat. But back at RAF St. Evil, Greeley didn't feel like a hero. He just felt tired. He unbuckled his flak vest, tossed his gloves onto the bench, and stared at his mirror. The same one, cracked now from vibration and pitted with salt. He muttered, "Guess you earned your keep, sweetheart." The hangar doors opened and a jeep screeched to a stop. 2 officers stepped out, Major Collins, the squadron commander, and a British intelligence officer in a trench coat who looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Sergeant Greeley?" Collins barked. "Yes, sir." The Brit stepped forward. "You're the one who saw the U-boat?" Greeley nodded. "With a mirror?" Greeley scratched his neck. "Well, technically, sir, with the light in the mirror." The Brit blinked. "You're either very lucky or you've just handed us something remarkable." They led him to the briefing hut, where a map of the Atlantic was pinned with red and blue strings. The intelligence officer pointed to the route of HX-286. "That submarine you hit? U-1229. She'd already sunk 2 freighters from the previous convoy. She was setting up for another ambush," Collins added quietly. "We didn't pick her up on radar or sonar. The only reason the convoy's intact is because you spotted that reflection." Greeley looked confused. "So, I get a commendation or a fine?" Neither man smiled. The Brit finally said, "We're calling this an unauthorized but effective modification." That phrase would become famous in RAF and USAAF maintenance circles, code for "he broke the rules, but it worked." Over the next week, the Sea Witch's mission report traveled up the chain of command, to 479th Group Headquarters, to the 8th Air Force in London, and finally to the Anti-Submarine Warfare Command. The reaction was disbelief. An internal memo from Wright Field summed it up. Mechanic-installed mirror on B-24 yields early visual detection of enemy sub. Results cannot be replicated in controlled test. Possibly anecdotal. Possibly anecdotal. Bureaucratic shorthand for miracles don't exist. But miracles leave data. And the data was impossible to ignore. 3 other B-24 crews in the same sector started mounting their own mirrors, using anything from truck parts to spooned aluminum from canteen trays. Within weeks, sightings of U-boats increased by 17%. Depth charge accuracy rose. Convoy losses fell. Command didn't officially endorse it, not yet. But pilots whispered about it in mess halls and hangars. Someone even drew a cartoon in the group newsletter. A B-24 pilot polishing a mirror while shouting, "Who needs radar?" Greeley hated that cartoon. He wasn't mocking science. He was proving its limits. When the next patrol came, he refused to remove his mirror, even under inspection. His crew chief rolled his eyes and muttered, "You know, Greeley, one day someone's going to write a book about how a mechanic beat the Germans with a Jeep part." Greeley smirked. "Yeah, and no one will believe it." He was right. Official records credited enhanced visual scanning, not a mirror. The paperwork turned his defiance into doctrine without naming him. But his squadron knew. Every time they took off over the gray Atlantic, someone would tap their mounted mirror for luck. A quiet superstition born from one man's stubbornness. In a war that worshipped machines, Greeley reminded everyone that sometimes the smallest piece of glass could reflect the biggest truth, that survival didn't come from perfection. It came from people like him, men too restless to wait for permission. August 1944. The war in the Atlantic was turning. The U-boats were retreating, hunted relentlessly from above. But the ocean still had teeth, and one of them was about to bite back. The Sea Witch was deep into its 17th patrol, flying low through the morning mist. The air smelled of oil and salt. The engines beat like slow thunder. Inside, 12 men worked in silence, each sound magnified, each vibration memorized. Sergeant Tom Greeley checked his guns, then adjusted his mirror, a ritual by now. It was scratched, warped at the edges, but still clear enough to catch the faint shimmer of water. The pilot's voice came over the intercom. "Weather's closing in. Visibility's down to half a mile. Keep your eyes open. Command says a wolf pack was spotted near our route yesterday." "Roger that," Greeley said. "If I see anything, I'll wink at it." For 2 hours, nothing. Just gray waves, darker gray clouds, and the monotony of the Atlantic. Then, through the static and the roar, the radar operator shouted, "Contact! 2 miles off port side. Faint blip, maybe a wake." The pilot banked left. Greeley leaned into his mirror and froze. There it was again. A quick silver flash. Not sunlight this time, but metal breaking through foam. "Visual contact. U-boat surfacing. 9 o'clock low." The Sea Witch dived. Greeley's heart pounded as the bomber tilted forward, her engine screaming. The bombardier opened the bomb bay doors. Depth charges armed, fuses hot. But this time the Germans were ready. The U-boat's deck gun opened fire, shells bursting across the sea. One round grazed the B-24's wingtip, tearing metal and spraying fuel. Another slammed into the tail, rattling the fuselage. "Hit on the port stabilizer," yelled the engineer. "Fuel leak." "Stay on target," said the pilot through clenched teeth. "We've got 1 run." The world narrowed to sound. The shriek of wind, the clatter of shrapnel, the heartbeat in Greeley's ears. He stared through his mirror again, lining up the reflection. The periscope dead center. He yelled, "Now! Drop, drop, drop!" The charges fell, spinning toward the water, 4 tiny dots in the mirror's curved world. The bomber roared overhead, engines coughing, smoke trailing from its wing. A second later, the ocean exploded. The blast lifted the U-boat out of the sea, its hull cracking in half before sliding under in a boiling cloud of oil. The Sea Witch shuddered, barely staying level. The co-pilot screamed, "Engine 2's on fire!" Greeley crawled forward through smoke, grabbed a fire extinguisher and blasted the flames. His hands burned, his face blackened from oil, but the fire died. The bomber was limping, one wing half torn, mirror still dangling by a bolt. The pilot's voice came through, hoarse but calm. "Convoy safe. Sub destroyed. We're turning home." It took 4 hours to crawl back to base. By the time they landed, the runway was lined with ambulances and ground crews. The Sea Witch's belly scraped the tarmac, leaking fuel and smoke. As the engines died, the crew climbed out, dazed and silent. Greeley stepped down last, carrying the broken mirror in his hand. The commander walked up to him, shaking his head. "You got us another kill, Greeley," he said quietly. "But you've got to stop using that damn mirror." Greeley looked at the shattered glass, the edge catching the last rays of sunlight. "Guess it's done its job," he said. That night, in the barracks, someone nailed the cracked mirror to the wall above their bunks. Beneath it, someone scribbled in charcoal, "Luck, Light, and Greeley." Over the next month, other crews began copying the idea. By the end of 1944, mirrored mounts became standard on several B-24 squadrons. The official reports never mentioned his name, just improved rear visibility equipment. But the men who flew with it knew. They called it the Greeley glass. And when the war ended, the Sea Witch's mirror, scratched, cracked, and stained with salt, was still hanging in that hangar. The only piece of a bomber that had faced death twice and seen it first both times. By the end of 1944, the Atlantic War had shifted decisively. The wolf packs were shattered, their radio codes cracked, their once fearsome reach now strangled by constant Allied patrols. And among those victories, Buried deep in maintenance reports and mission logs was one mechanic's name scrawled in grease pencil: Sergeant Thomas Greeley. He never saw himself as an inventor. He didn't talk about optics or engineering. He talked about survival. He once told a war correspondent, "Machines don't win wars. Men who refuse to quit do." When the Sea Witch was decommissioned, engineers stripped her for inspection. They found bullet scars, patched wings, and one strange relic still bolted beside the waist gun: a rusted Jeep mirror, edges warped, frame bent. Someone had etched 3 words into the mount: "See it first." Word of the mirror spread quietly through the ranks. Maintenance manuals started including a single, unexplained note: optional reflective device, field use, proven effective under daylight patrol. No credit line, no story. Just a small acknowledgement that in a world ruled by rules, one illegal fix had worked. Historians later pieced the rest together. Greeley's crew had flown 23 missions without a single loss. Their convoy coverage success rate was nearly 40% higher than average. And of all the near-miss encounters logged by the squadron, none ever reported being surprised from below again. What Greeley's mirror symbolized wasn't just ingenuity. It was rebellion with purpose. He didn't challenge orders out of arrogance. He did it because the system wasn't keeping up with the war he was living in. That's the paradox of total war. The higher the stakes, the more it depends on people willing to bend the rules. The Germans built doctrines. The Americans built results. For every scientist in a lab perfecting radar, there was a man like Greeley on the line, covered in oil, guessing, testing, daring the math to fail him. His commanding officer once said after the war, "If he'd been born 20 years earlier, he'd have been arrested for breaking protocol. 20 years later, they'd have called him a genius." The truth sits somewhere between. Greeley wasn't a genius. He was a mirror, a reflection of what made the Allied machine so unstoppable: creativity under pressure, courage under orders, defiance under fear. And maybe that's why his story endured not in museums, but in memory. Pilots and gunners would tell it like a myth. The stubborn mechanic who glued a mirror to his bomber and spotted death before it could strike. He never patented it, never wrote it down. He just smiled when asked about it years later at a veterans reunion. "Did it really work, Tom?" someone asked. He shrugged. "Well, I'm still here, ain't I?" The crowd laughed, but for the men who'd flown those cold patrols, that line meant everything. Because when you've stared into the gray Atlantic long enough, you learn that survival isn't about luck. It's about seeing first. And sometimes, all it takes to change the course of a convoy, or a war, is a reflection in a 3-inch circle of glass, held steady by a man who refused to look away. When the war finally ended, the Atlantic fell silent. The convoys turned into trade ships again, the bombers into relics, and the bases into ghost towns of rust and wind. But somewhere in a forgotten hangar at RAF St. Evil, Greeley's mirror still hung from a nail, cracked, salt-stained, and reflecting nothing but dust. Tom Greeley went home to Maine in the fall of 1945. He didn't talk about the war much. He fixed boat engines, tuned farm trucks, and sometimes stared at the horizon with that same faraway focus, like he was still searching for a flash of danger on the sea. Neighbors said he worked like a man chasing time. His hands never stopped moving. His tools never stopped ringing. When asked about his service, he'd grin and say, "Just kept her flying." It wasn't until 1962 that a Navy historian tracked him down. The man had been compiling declassified reports from the Anti-Submarine Command and wanted to confirm one entry: field modification resulting in improved visual detection. Greeley read the line, laughed, and said, "Yeah, that was me. Guess I broke a few laws to save a few ships." The historian asked if he still had the mirror. Greeley nodded toward the boathouse. Inside, mounted above his workbench, was a convex mirror, pitted, dull, and covered in fingerprints. "I like to see who's sneaking up behind me," he said. That mirror never ended up in a museum. It didn't need to. Its legacy was already airborne, replicated across hundreds of bombers, codified into doctrine, and immortalized in the statistics no one questioned. Fewer convoys lost, more men home. Years later, an Air Force engineer reviewing B-24 innovations wrote, "It wasn't technology alone that won the Atlantic. It was the courage to improvise, to see differently." And that's the lesson that outlived the war. Because in every conflict since, from radar jammers to stealth plating, the same truth echoes. Progress doesn't come from permission. It comes from the minds that refuse to wait for it. Greeley never called himself brave, never called himself clever. He was just a man with dirty hands and clear eyes, who understood that seeing was surviving. If you asked him today what he'd tell the next generation of engineers, he'd probably say something simple. Don't wait for the manual. Look at the damn mirror. Because sometimes the smallest reflection can illuminate the biggest truths. And sometimes the line between genius and madness is just a few inches of glass, and the courage to bolt it on anyway.